Hello there, this is Steve here in Sydney of the late Gnosis website truebluehealer.com, where you can get physical evidence of your divine spark activation in just 20 minutes. You'll know something's changed, and that'll be followed by some vivid messaging dreams and ultimately an internal mentoring voice, which will gradually reveal to you that there's a lot more to you than you ever believed. I would imagine that you have been convinced, or many of you, or will have been at least partially convinced by the education system around you, that you're really just a highly ascended animal, and the most mundane materialistic explanations of everything should suffice for you. Well, it's not true. There's a lot more to every human than they've been taught by the media around them. So the main function of the great religions, all of them, is to distract you from your personal potential, and I assure you it's far greater than any mere materialist explanation. Okay, so all questions are answered at the website. There's an email link there. Any question will be answered. So I'll leave you there at truebluehealer.com. The subject of this video is meant to be personal. It's your personal future. If you're European, you're in Europe or in any one of the European settled countries, this is your future intended for you by your society's enemies. Can you believe you have enemies? You personally? Well, you do, and I'm going to show you what's intended by your enemies towards you, and here is an image. Have a good look at this. Yes, those crucifixions you've just seen are in fact what happened in 1915 in Islamic State Turkey. Okay, it's called the Armenian Massacre, where the Armenian Genocide now officially passed in the German Parliament very recently, a couple of days ago, and 1.5 million Armenian Christians were killed in a variety of ways, but if you look them up, all the grisly photographs, you'll notice it's exactly the same as what Islamic State's doing today. So, Islamic State-themed butchery and massacre has been basically Islam through the ages for 1400 years. ISIS has always existed. It was once upon a time it was called the Ottoman Empire, and before that it was called a few other names, but extreme savagery, and I invite you to come and look at some of these pictures because it may affect your personal future. Okay, there's pictures of all the things you get from Islamic State: beheadings, people being dropped in acid, people being burned alive, people being thrown off buildings, people being hanged, mass hangings, mass crucifixions. Are these pictures too much for you to look at? Well, maybe you should learn about reality, that you have enemies plotting in other countries and other cultures to do all those things to you because they've been trained for some 1400 years to do it. The holy books say it gets them 72 virgins in heaven, for goodness sake, martyrdom for killing the kafirs, the unbelievers. The Islamic religion is so different to Christianity, which says thou shalt not kill. Islam says thou must kill. Totally the opposite. But you don't know that because you grew up in the luxurious heaven on earth called the Western world. But I'm trying to get something across to you, that your days may be numbered unless you wake up and do a few things. Okay, I'm going to talk about that now. The Ottoman Empire is centred around Turkey, and it's been around more than 1,000 years it's been going. For many hundreds of years they were referred to as Ottomans. Earlier on they were not called Muslims, they weren't called Islam, they were called Saracens. Okay? Crusaders fought people called Saracens, who were fanatical jihadis desperate to die in battle to ensure their own martyrdom, whereas the Crusaders were fighting to stay alive. So, can you see the huge difference there? Can you see the huge difference in culture? That's something we have to learn to wake up to and deal with. We can't just go on ignoring it in our Western world heaven, okay? Islamic people have always been a fairly unskilled lot of people. Their main income for many, many centuries was simply buying and selling of slaves, taking slaves, invading the next country along domino principle, enslaving 3/4 of the population, selling them, okay? So, To give you an example of the body count, Bill Warner states, he's a physicist who does studies on this, they've now got accurate figures based on trading in the Mediterranean, and numbers of shipwrecks and layers of sediment reveal much about the economy of Mediterranean nations at different times in history. And Bill Warner says, he's always a good guy to listen to, he talks about the death toll in Europe alone being 250 million dead. He doesn't specify whether the 112 million Africans taken into slavery by Islam is included in that figure. But I'll tell you what happened to the 112 million slaves taken into slavery by the Ottomans, then called the Saracens. Most of them died within a few weeks of castration. Okay, genital mutilation is an obsession that Islamic people have, and it's now coming to the fore in Britain. There's 500 reported to hospitals per month. They're the ones that go wrong. Okay, that's female genital mutilation in girls. Why would you want such a thing in your society? Yet it's been brought in against the common person's will in Europe, being done behind their back. Numbers are being suppressed, so you won't notice rising horrors around you like the frogs in the pot. Okay, because Muslims were mostly warriors trading slaves, they didn't have many skills, job skills, building skills, that sort of thing. There's no occupational skills mentioned in the Quran, oddly enough, whereas other religions talk about carpentry and stonemasons and stuff like that. So they needed slavery to get skilled people. All the preservation of science that they talk about, what the Muslims did for us, preserving science in the Middle Ages, was actually all translated by captured slaves, Christian slaves. And all those harems you see, ancient pictures of harems, they were all Christian white women captured from the south coast of England, south coast of Ireland, okay? More than 1 million Christians were taken into North African slavery, okay, between about 1500 and 1600. Did you know that? Now, to keep people as slaves, Islam used to have them pay a sort of poll tax. They call them dhimmis, and we call it dhimmitude, where you basically pay to stay alive. So you pay a poll tax to stay alive for one more week. If you pay us next week, we won't kill you. That's literally what Islam works on. That's how they collect money from slaves, from people working. You see, they permit you to stay alive to pay them taxes so they don't have to work. So that's why Islam is so undeveloped and has no inventions, no job skills, no work ethic today. You notice that about all the Muslims, and they are the lowest on the IQ ladders of the entire world. Look up comparative IQs. Muslim nations are at the bottom of it because of their culture, okay, of depending on slavery, basically. Well, toward the end of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was crumbling. Nations were just making their own freedom, saying, what are you going to do to us? You haven't got any military force. You're not in charge of us in North Africa anymore. We're going independent. And the Ottoman Empire was collapsing. And it got so, what can I say, some people were emboldened. Armenians, 2 million Armenians in the eastern province of Turkey started agitating for normal citizen rights, not to have to pay the poll tax to stay alive, and be able to ride horses and be treated as a normal citizen with the same equal rights as everybody else, you see. As a result, 1894 to 1896, a few 100,000 of them were massacred by the Turkish Islamic government, you see. One of the reasons for the collapse of the Ottoman Empire was the fact that it was administered in a medieval way, such as paying annual tribute was still happening in the North African states. Tribute was collected on an annual basis, and if you didn't pay the tribute, you'd be invaded by the Caliph's army, and all your leaders would be butchered, and the whole city would be taken into slavery. And that would create a whole lot of money selling the slaves to other city-states, you see. And that's how the Islamic Empire was run for many, many hundreds of years. Needless to say, it didn't bring on any creativity. It didn't produce any problem-solving abilities in people's heads. It produced a lot of grief and a lot of sorrow, and a tremendous amount of suffering. And if you read books written by escaped slaves in the 17th and 18th centuries. Yes, they were practicing slavery up to the end of the 19th century. and it still exists today in the world today. The authorities of Islamic nations often turn a blind eye to slavery, but that's how they didn't have much economic development, because they depended on slavery. So, one thing holding them back, the Islamic world, was their cursive Arab script, which couldn't be printed. So when the printing revolution came into being in the Western world, with a 26-character alphabet of separate letters, we could start our knowledge explosion, which didn't happen in the Islamic world because of the cursive Arab script. And for 400 years, that seriously held back the Arab culture. Okay? About 1908, some people who had done some overseas travel realised how backward Turkey was remaining because of its old-fashioned medieval ways. And three pashas came to power. They were abolishing the old caliphate. And sometime later, about 1908, I believe, a man who's revered in history called Ataturk came to power, and he realised how backward Turkey was, and he set about educating Turkish people all over the country in one great new idea, where we learn to use the modern 32-character Cyrillic alphabet, so we can read printed books for the first time in 400 years. Ataturk is heroised for doing this. He is revered as a great reforming leader. And he was a brutal dictator, though. And so this is the story of, the usual excuse we make for dictators, standardising weights and measures. He improved reading and writing 1,000-fold. And then came what he really came to power to do. He genocided 1.5 million Armenians, okay? The crime being they were Christians. Now, he didn't think of it himself. And what put the idea into his head? Well, there had been riots. Thousands had been killed in the 1890s. And these dhimmis, which were basically leftovers from the old Islamic Empire, not riding horses and having to pay taxes to stay alive for one more week, that sort of thing. He was approached by some people posing as Turkish Muslims, but in fact they were crypto Jews. And you often find behind militant Muslims, crypto Jews lobbying them to be more aggressive and carry out the Quran to its utmost letter of its Islamic law. And that includes massacring, killing all unbelievers, the kafirs. They're called kafirs. I'm not sure how you pronounce it, depends where you come from, right? The kafirs are the unbelievers, and they must all be killed, and by so doing, you assure yourself of martyrdom, so you're guaranteed to go to the brothel in heaven, okay, with 72 virgins. So it's in the Jewish Encyclopedia that crypto Jews posing as Turkish Muslims, Turkish Muslim intellectuals, talked Ataturk into massacring 1.5 million Armenians, you see. So it looks like Muslims did it, but you'll find behind every great Muslim evil there seems to be lobbying cloaked Jewish people, lobby groups. Okay, find them in the Armenian Genocide, you find them in the Hitler's Holocaust, surprise, surprise, surprise. You'll find them in the Rwandan massacre, and you'll also find them absolutely in total control of the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution just 2 years later, which killed some 30 million white Russians whose crime was that they were Christians. Okay, so always find Jews in the background of all these great massacres. Interesting situation that we have there to deal with. Its history, we must face it. Okay? I'm going to tell you a little bit about how this genocide was done, 1915, in Armenian Turkey, because I want you to know that it's planned for you, dear European viewer. Okay? I want you to read, to know about this. And one of the best things you could do as a European is, this has got to be publicised on every lamppost in Europe. You can make posters with Erdogan, who wants to reinstitute the Ottoman Empire by getting his people into Europe through EU membership for free. So they can just literally populate up until you can be massacred, you can be crucified, you can be decapitated, and the police will stand watching, scared of being called racist. Okay, there's a time when we're going to have a lot of Muslim policemen if we keep going down this path. A lot of Muslim people in the armed forces. Everyone's just going to stand around and say, well, that's the law, isn't it? I didn't see that. Well, isn't that funny? Christians crucified. Ha, 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 ha. That chilling picture I showed you is real. It's not a movie. And I'll be putting it on the end of this video for you. And I want you to think about this and meditate on it. Okay? And I'll now tell you how the genocide took place. And it's a classic genocide thing. The genocide was committed by two groups of people. A special group of executioners who were given a special executioner's uniform, and they were all photographed in front of military headquarters, which is still standing today. Okay, there is no doubt about this. And there were two sets of messages, all of them archived in Turkish records. There was public domain warnings and announcements to the general public that Armenians were all going to be rounded up and deported, was the phrase. And there were secret communications inside the government where they laid bare what they were really doing, you see, and how they were going to tell the lies and keep the deception going as long as possible to minimise panic. So it was called a deportation. Now what happens? Well, policemen come knocking on your door and you see yourself 6 o'clock in the morning, okay? Policeman comes knocking on your door and says, right, you're getting on a bus now, that bus there, get in it now. Oh, but I'm only wearing a dressing gown. Well, where you're going, you won't need any more clothes, you're told. And are your children there? Bring them too. Is your husband home? Has he gone to work yet? Oh, right. Well, you can come too. You're all in the bus together, right? Okay, so that's how it was done. People were moved out of towns and villages, out of earshot, and a lot of them were shot by the gendarmes, the police, who were doing the rounding up. They were just shot out of sound range of the villages and towns. Not always buried in mass graves, often just left out in the open. The execution squads were doing the mass shootings outside towns and villages out of earshot, okay? A lot of other people were just marched out into the desert to die, because after 3 or 4 days without water and food, you're not much good for anything. And you'll see lots of horrifying photos of skin and bones people literally falling down in front of the camera, okay? There's plenty of those pictures. I want you to look at them and see yourself rounded up the same way with a policeman knocking on your door at 6 o'clock in the morning. What would you do? How would you respond to that? How would you stop it happening to your next door neighbours? Would you intervene if you saw your neighbours being taken away? I'll bet you wouldn't. You'd just be slack and lazy. It's none of my business. I'll go to work as usual. You could do it a few days running and you wouldn't notice, would you? Oh, a lot of sick leave today. Where's everybody gone? I wonder. I'm the only one here today. Golly. Erdogan, the unwily president of Turkey, wants to re-establish the collapsed Ottoman Empire. That's why he's in bed with ISIS. And it's kind of fascinating. You notice that ISIS does all the gruesome types of execution specified in the Quran for the unbelievers. And if you really want to, you can go and look at grisly photographs of 12-year-old children sawn in half. That's a favourite Islamic execution method. There's people been dropped in acid very recently by ISIS, and throwing people off buildings. You've heard all that. You're very glad this is happening in Syria, right, and not at home in Europe, right? Okay, well, there's a bit of a problem because the very people who are doing this, you are bringing them in. Most Muslims are apathetic and don't read their own Quran, but in surveys in London they reveal they will harbour terrorists because it's an easy thing for an apathetic person to do. Give them shelter, give them food, let them use your car, your licence, your telephone, but you wouldn't actually dob them into the government, no matter how many people they kill, because they're kafirs, okay? This is the lazy apathy that could spell the doom of the Western world if you don't do something about this. Erdogan wants to establish his Ottoman Empire, re-establish it, reinvigorate it by taking over Europe, by just dumping 20-30 million Turkish people in there. And as usual, like so many politicians, he's got a double standard. He's got stuff he'll say on the international stage in front of TV cameras, and then totally different stuff he'll say for his hometown crowd that he talks to, his domestic constituency, when they're in Europe, he addresses Turks and talks about, we're going to take over soon. All we've got to do is get more of our own people into Europe. And the good news is that, well, very, very surprisingly for me, Germany's actually voted to support, very recently the other day, to certify the Armenian Genocide as a genuine, world-registered genocide. America refuses to do it for political reasons because Turkey's a NATO member. Turkey's in a strategic position. But I was pleasantly surprised that even the Green groups condemned the Armenian Genocide of 1915. But it started in 1894 and it continued long after World War I. They were still massacring the remnants of the Armenians in 1921, long after the war, okay? So jihad continued. It's a religious duty, and a lot of Muslims in Turkey were still getting their martyrdom guaranteed by killing the Kafirs, okay, the Christian Armenians, who never hurt anybody. I've never heard of Armenians massacring anybody else. The best news about is that Erdogan is spitting chips over the fact that the Armenian Genocide of 1915 has been called an official genocide, and he won't admit it. Everyone else knows about it. It's heavily documented, by the way, in photographs. Like all genocides, photography was strictly forbidden of the Holocaust going on in Armenia. But some German soldiers stationed in Turkey at the time didn't know about the rule, and they happily taking snapshots of massacres, crucifixions, decapitations, etc. And I do invite you to look at them to remind yourself of the future of Europe. This is what Islam wants to do to Europe. It's the Islamic way of life. Either kill or enslave people. That's it. That's all they know. That's their whole culture for 1400 years. So it's highly likely, because there's 72 reasons for not admitting Turkey to the EU, that this is the final straw, that Erdogan won't even consider looking at the Armenian Genocide as a serious historical mistake. The reason he can't do that is he's such a crackpot. He wants to do it all over again in Europe and kill 500 million people instead and fill Europe with Turkish people. That's what he wants to do. Okay, so unwittingly he's showing his hands sort of like a naive card player. He thinks he can get away with speaking domestically at meetings where everything's recorded and filmed and videoed, and then speaking different promises in the public domain to international leaders. You can't get away with that anymore, and it's a tremendous naivety, and the internet will be his undoing, I think. As it will many secret operations, I think. So, why do we need to talk about genocides? Why can't we just forget them all? Well, that's the recipe for repeating genocide. Adolf Hitler used as a model, he used it as motivation. He actually wrote, "No one cares about the Armenian Genocide." He damn well knew about it. And he actually wrote, well, nothing happened, no one grieves for them, no one said anything, nothing happened. So I can do it too. I can take out ethnic groups the same way. Nobody's going to do anything. We already have a good historic precedent. Adolf Hitler wrote that much more concisely, but he certainly took a lesson from the Armenian Genocide. And that's why you've got to know about it, because your knowing about it can prevent more genocides happening. And I greatly fear for massive genocides occurring in Europe in the next 10 or 20 years. In my last video I talked about a Holocaust coming, because the perpetrators of all these Holocausts, the Jewish lobbyists, can't keep hiding. Their role is becoming increasingly transparent. So they can't keep hiding behind lobby groups and company names and George Soros funded organisations and that sort of thing. People are joining the dots for themselves at home in their own lounge rooms, and you can't get mainstream media propaganda to compete with it anymore. Okay? So that's why we need to talk about genocide, to proof ourselves against further genocides. Otherwise they will continue ad infinitum. And ultimately people know they're wrong, or they wouldn't try to hide them, would they? They know deep down what they're doing is wrong. If they really believed that it was the right and religious thing to do, they'd be shouting it from the rooftops, wouldn't they? But they never do. They always know deep down it's wrong what they're doing, which is why they try to hide it. So here's something that European citizens could do. You really need to get in people's heads and in people's faces everywhere they look in Europe. I know you've got advertising in your face. You really need to see this picture of crucified Christians on every lamppost in Europe. Now that could be done with backyard activists. It can be done on websites. Wherever you look on the internet, you find this reminder of what Islam brings to you after they've taken over with peaceful migration. They simply outnumber you. They infiltrate the police and the armed forces. And then you get the call, knock on the door at 6 o'clock in the morning. You can come in your dressing gown. You won't need any more clothes where you're going. It's okay, madam. Are your children there? Get on that bus. I've got a piece of paper here giving me a warrant. Okay? This is planned in two great countries, Europe and America. Okay? And mentioning America brings me back to another point. Europe's got to change in the sense that I think they'll have to become armed and far more vigilant and more paranoid toward their own governments, like Americans are. Americans have refused to put their guns down. Gun ownership is certified in their constitution, whereas Europeans have been disarmed. Did you know Adolf Hitler disarmed the German people to prevent coups knocking him out of power? So by disarming a population, you can practically guarantee you're safely ensconced in power forever. Okay. Now, European governments have to be taken out of office one way or another, and Austria's just recently shown a very positive upward bulge in nationalist sentiment, which we're going to need a lot more of throughout Europe, and I'm hoping that the Austrian positive rise in sentiment will be echoed in other European countries, and I hope it spells the beginning of the end for all of the European governments, including the British. Which brings us to Brexit. I'm wondering if the election of Sadiq Khan, who's another Islamic fanatic, to the mayorship of London, and Erdogan's refusal to back down on admitting the Armenian genocide was just that. I hope that affects the Brexit poll, which is coming very soon, this month I believe. If Britain decides to remain in the EU, it doesn't look good for me. It looks like dark clouds getting darker over Europe. So I'm going to leave you here with some pictures of the Armenian genocide. These are all freely available online, and they really do have to be slapped on the wall in every public toilet in Europe. They've got to be on every lamppost. You need to put it wherever you can put this kind of warning to try and get through to people. You can put it in emails, make it a lead line for your email. This is where you're headed, Europe. Erdogan does not have a nice, pleasant, peaceful outlook at all. He's a madman, a genocidal maniac, okay? And he just wants to do more of the Armenian massacre to Europe. If he can kill 500 million people, he will do it, okay? Simple as that. So these kind of images, which were illicitly taken in 1915, are the future that Erdogan has planned for Europe. Okay, as well as the Muslim Brotherhood, the Saudi royal family, etc., and Prince Charles, who built the biggest mosque in London. Okay, they're all welcoming this future coming out of the past from medieval Islam. Okay, here's the pictures. Can I just add something? I want to sort of reply to some thoughts you're probably having, that it wouldn't happen to me. I'm in a beautiful European country. I'm in a wonderful American state, that sort of thing, and I'm so safe here, and we have police and law and order and everything. They catch you by surprise because the plans have been made in advance in a secret. If you read Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, where people were rounded up and put into work camps, concentration camps in freezing Siberia, etc., and a common conversation amongst all these people put into these giant prison camps was, I don't know why I'm here. I really can't work it out. How could I get 10 years in a prison camp when I didn't do anything? All I ever got was told I'd had some counter-revolutionary conversation or something, conversation thoughts or something. The word counter-revolutionary was mentioned, right? So you criticise Lenin or something, so you get 10 years in the prison camp. And then at the end of the 10-year prison camp of not knowing why you were there, 10 years of being in there, being half worked to death, if you were still alive, you could find yourself at the end of your sentence looking forward to getting out, and you'd be brought into the commandant's office, and he's an NKVD officer with a sidearm, he's wearing a grey uniform, and he happens to be Jewish. And he'd put his feet up on the desk and he's laid back and he's got his hands beside his head, and he's saying to you, well, Igor, you've just had 10 years here and you're facing getting out soon, aren't you? And a little bit of small talk ensues, and you don't want to say anything that might upset the man in charge of your life. So you don't start complaining you've been 10 years there for nothing. You just listen to what you're being told, and a bit of small talk ensues. And the NKVD officer sort of suddenly grins at you and he says, well, I don't think you're sufficiently rehabilitated. I think, in my estimation, my personal opinion, that you need at least another 10 years of servitude in this freezing prison camp to rehabilitate you from your, counter-revolutionary thoughts. So you got another 20 years, which is basically a death sentence, okay? And that's a continuing theme of conversations amongst prisoners in the Gulag Archipelago, selected by Alexander Solzhenitsyn in his very famous book. Well worth reading if you want to see the future of Europe, because that's what is planned for you. If you're not hanged, if you're not shot, you'll end up in some kind of prison camp with either Muslim or Jewish guards looking after you, and you won't know why you're there, and your crime is being European, not being a believer, not being Jewish, not being Muslim. Okay? And that is planned for you by these two twin enemies, we might call them, enemies of reason, enemies of civilization, enemies of life itself. Okay? I just thought I'd throw that in for you, give you some idea about a future planned for you. Steve here. And have you noticed how you have a curious lack of knowledge of the Soviet Union and the Gulag Archipelago, the rise of Lenin, Stalin, etc., and it has never been presented to you by Jewish Hollywood, has it? Oh, I wonder why. Golly, Miss Molly, what a surprise. You haven't been told about this, because the more quiet you keep it, the greater your chance of success next time. You see, that's the idea of keeping you blind about Russian history. It's easy to brush up on Russian history. Just get on YouTube.